Democracy and the Rule of Law, Liberal Ideas and Marxist Critiques, by Bob Fine. I'm going to read the table of contents. Classical jurisprudence prefiguring the bourgeois revolution, the defeat of traditional natural law theory, Hobbes' theory of, quote, public authority, Rousseau's theory of the, quote, general will, Adam Smith's theory of, quote, natural liberty, Hegel's theory of the, quote, rational state. Marx's critique of classical jurisprudence, democratizing the rational state, against Hegel's image of the rational state, civil society against the state. The genesis of Marx's class theory of law and state, abandoning the rational state. The German ideology, first steps in a new direction. Law, state, and capital. Political economy and jurisprudence. Questions of method. On the idea of private property. Freedom, equality, and commodity production. Freedom, equality, and capitalist relations of production. Bourgeois and socialist democracy. Bourgeois democracy. Socialist democracy. The contradictory foundation of law and the state. The law form, the money form, and the generalization of commodity production. The contradictory functions of law. The state form, the capital form, and capitalist relations of production. 20th century theories. The withering away of law in the state, the rule of law and class. The withering away of law in the state, Evgeny Pashukanis. Rule of law and class struggle, Edward Thompson. Power without people, Michel Foucault. Conclusion. Let me get down to the beginning of the first chapter. Introduction. My question concerns the relation between Marxist and liberal ideas about private property, law, and the state, and my starting point is a discontent with two polar versions of Marxism, each of which seem to me to be in its own way equally mistaken. On the one side, Marxism appears as no more than an extension of liberalism, committed to the establishment of the rule of law, parliamentary representation, an impartial police and army, separation of powers between legislature, executive, and judiciary, and a check on the excesses of private property by state intervention. It is said that liberal ideas about legality and democracy are fully adequate for socialists. It is only a question of defending them against their subversion, of extending them into the economic sphere of capitalist society, or of realizing them fully through the establishment of socialism. The strength of this approach lies in its appreciation of the achievements of liberal thought, in its recognition of the importance of fighting for or defending the establishment of liberal principles of democracy, the rule of law, civil liberties, etc., and in its efforts to forge a political alliance with liberals on these grounds. Its weakness lies in its tendency to divorce liberal forms of authority from their class base. Its elevation of the rule of law, parliamentary representation, civil liberties, etc., into eternal truths rather than historical accomplishments, its failure to perceive the limited democratic character of these forms, and its inability to shake off the shackles which liberal constitutionalism imposes on democratic struggles. The alliance which this sort of Marxism seeks to forge with liberalism is a marriage in which Marxism is subordinated to liberalism and, in my view, loses its own independent and distinctive identity. On the other side, Marxism sometimes appears as no more than a negation of liberalism. It presents liberal ideas of freedom and equality before the law, of parliamentary democracy, of impartial administration and policing, etc., as mere frauds which serve as an instrument of class rule, which function to reproduce relations of production based on the expropriation of the majority by the minority, and which obscure the brute realities of oppression and exploitation. Freedom of property appears as little more than freedom to exploit. The law appears little more than an ideological instrument of oppression and the state as essentially authoritarian. From this perspective, it may seem that current attacks by the right on liberal freedoms expose the true coercive nature of property and authority in capitalist society, which liberals previously obscured under the veneer of, quote, rights and, quote, law. The task of socialists appears thus not as one of spreading illusions about liberalism, whose ideals, if they ever could be realized, can no longer, but rather to make a clean break from liberalism and struggle instead in socialist ways for the establishment of socialist forms of authority entirely distinct from those advocated within the liberal tradition. The strength of this approach lies in its critique of the class basis of liberal thought and in its assertion of the independence of Marxism from liberalism. Its weakness, however, seems to me to lie in its inability to grasp not only the achievements of liberal thought, but also to grasp the debt that Marxism has to it. Marxism is not just a rejection of liberalism. This is true of many kinds of radical and reactionary doctrines, but rather a rejection of a definite kind, one that pursues further the principles of democracy and individual liberty, which liberalism proclaimed but then inhibited. Thus, a Marxist critique of freedom and equality before the law, as opposed to other critiques, does not cynically dismiss these ideals as mere illusions, but rather addresses itself to their historical presuppositions and to the restrictive democracy which they express. In securing the independence of Marxism from liberalism, this sort of, quote, left Marxism tends to subordinate Marxism to other anti-liberal doctrines akin to anti-authoritarianism, nihilism, or to the bureaucratic statism now associated with Stalin's name. While rightly rejecting an alliance in which Marxism is subsumed under liberalism, Marxism may be turned into a sectarian refusal under all circumstances to ally with liberalism irrespective of the terms of the alliance. My purpose in writing this book is to develop our understanding of the relation between Marxism and liberalism beyond either of these two unsatisfactory alternatives. To this end, I have returned to the classical text in order to provide an exposition and critique of the liberal ideas on private property, law, and the state, which Marx inherited and confronted, of the development of Marx's own critique of jurisprudence, and of three selected attempts to interpret, extend, and in one case, quote, transcend, end quote, Marx's thought in the 20th century. The first section looks back to the main currents of liberal thought which preceded Marx, as exemplars of which I have chosen Hobbes, Rousseau, Adam Smith, and Hegel, and which together constitute the movement of classical jurisprudence. Classical jurisprudence flowered between the 1600s and 1800s in the period of the revolutionary ascendance of the bourgeoisie, alongside its close companion, classical political economy. Classical jurisprudence analyzed the economic, legal, and political requirements of capitalist society, on the one hand attacking the unfreedom, inequalities, economic stagnation, and cultural ignorance which characterized the old order, and on the other, prefiguring the forms of property and authority appropriate for a new order based on equality, freedom, growth, and rational thought. I examine what the liberal proponents of classical jurisprudence meant by private property law in the state, why liberal proponents of classical jurisprudence saw these institutions as intimately connected with one another and as the basis of human emancipation, the nature of their critiques of the, quote, traditional natural law theory, end quote, which preceded them, why they should be seen as representatives of a united movement despite the differences between them, and what the significance of these differences was. It was a rich and progressive cultural movement which sought to integrate a form of property based on individual freedom, equality, and security, with a form of authority based on the consent of the people as a whole. It fell far short of the democratic and social democratic ideas that developed in the 19th and 20th centuries, but it represented a high point of liberal jurisprudence, far superior both in its revolutionary ardor and in the quality of its analysis to the, quote, vulgar jurisprudence that followed. Its great strength lay in its grasp of the contradictions besetting private property and in its attempts to resolve these contradictions, not by going back to the narrow, stagnant, and unequal relations of dependency that belonged to the old order, but by establishing rational authority based on mutual consent. The attempt by modern right-wing thought to appropriate this tradition for itself in most respects represents a travesty of what classical jurisprudence actually stood for. However, contemporary Marxism has also had difficulties in relating to this tradition, sometimes counterposing one author to another as if they reflected entirely different principles, sometimes opposing their ideas on private property seen as altogether bad with their ideas on the rule of law seen as altogether good, sometimes losing sight of the progressive character of their critique of traditional natural law constraints on property and authority, sometimes artificially elevating one or other classical writer beyond his station, as it were, to the status of a, quote, Marxist, end quote, in all but name, sometimes, quote, forgetting, end quote, the strength of their conceptions of the state. It was on the basis of an intense study and critique of classical jurisprudence that Marx developed his own ideas on private property, law, and the state. Thus, it is difficult to get to grips with Marx's own theory without this background. Marx affirmed his debt to classical jurisprudence by emphasizing the, quote, advances he thought it had made, as well as the limitations of its liberalism. He held up the revolutionary ardor and rational criticism expressed in classical jurisprudence as a yardstick against which to measure the widespread vulgarization of liberal thought among his contemporaries. At the same time, Marx began to work through its own integral problems. At first, he criticized classical jurisprudence from within, employing classical jurisprudence's categories, but afforded to those categories a more radical democratic content. Marx's critique of classical jurisprudence was not achieved in one fell swoop, but was the result of an intense critical effort, the results of which were not given in advance. Thus, in his early writings, he retained Hegel's idea of the rational state, synthesizing individual liberty and the universal will, but rejected entirely the bureaucratic manner in which Hegel tried to realize this idea. He then began to explore what he saw as the contradiction between the freedom and universality inherent, on the one hand, in the ideal state, and the slavery and egoism inherent, on the other, in civil society, where the pursuit of private interest overrides any social concerns with the whole, leads to the impoverishment of the mass of population for the sake of the few, and subordinates all to the impersonal and uncontrollable power of the market. This critique by the young Marx of classical jurisprudence, the problem he posed, and the shortcomings of the solutions he offered, is the subject matter of my second section. Along with Engels, Marx set off in a new direction, attempting to cut free from his own Hegelian roots in favor of a class theory of law and state. Instead of counterposing the freedom and universality of law and the state to the slavery and egoism of civil society, he now saw law and the state as reflecting the slavery and egoism of civil society. Abandoning the idea of the, quote, rational state, end quote, as a weapon of criticism against the existing state, he now saw alienation and class domination as inherent in the idea of the state. However, his first efforts at developing this new approach, especially in the German ideology, were not surprisingly full of pitfalls and should not be taken as the last word on. However, his first efforts at developing this new approach, especially in the German ideology, were not surprisingly full of pitfalls, and should not be taken as the last word on, or even as the major statement of Marx's views. It was only in the course of his later theoretical and political writings that he was able to penetrate the contradictory rather than illusory character of the freedom, equality, and security associated with the pursuit of private property, the contradictory rather than illusory character of the universality of the state and the connections between private property, law, and the state. At this stage, he derived the alien character of the state not from private property, but from the division of labor as such, intended to reduce the universal character of the state to little more than a veil for the enslavement of labor to capital. The achievements and limitations of this approach are the subject of my third section. Marx never pursued his critique of jurisprudence to the same systematic extent to which he pursued his critique of political economy, though at various times he expressed a desire to do so. However, in his mature writings on economics, the Grundrisse and Capital, Marx developed a method of critique which can and should be adapted and applied to jurisprudence. He left numerous clues as to how the juridic aspects of capitalist social relations should be addressed. He offered a substantive analysis of capitalist relations of production, which provides a starting point for a critique of their juridic as well as their economic forms of expression. My fourth section seeks to piece together the elements of Marx's theoretical critique of jurisprudence from that of political economy, in order first to reveal the connecting links, the juridic categories of private property, law, and state, their transitory and historical character, and their derivation from the same relations of production which gave rise to the economic categories of value, money, and capital. Economics and jurisprudence are not reducible to each other, but are bound together as the twin forms assumed by capitalist relations of production. Just as Marx's critique of political economy was aimed not at replacing one economic theory by another, but rather at a social critique of economics in general, and looked forward to the dissolution of the economic sphere in its entirety, this too was the aim of his critique of jurisprudence. Marx revealed the shallow analyses which come from attaching private property, law, and the state to the surface of bourgeois society, i.e. commodity exchange, and from abstracting them from the inner content of bourgeois society, i.e. its relations of production. This leads either to a one-sided idealization of liberal notions of freedom, equality, and self-interest, or to their equally one-sided repudiation. In this way, Marx traced the roots both of liberal ideals of justice and of the negative critique of liberalism which developed as the obverse side of the same coin. By tracing juridic forms back to production relations, Marx was able to develop a dialectical view of the contradictory elements which run through private property, law, and the state. Marx's political writings reflected and developed this dialectic by analyzing the different relations between capital, labor, and other classes which develop in capitalist society and the different forms of state which accompany them. Marx criticized existing forms of law and state from the perspective of, quote, democracy, or to put the matter in reverse, from the perspective of overcoming the alienation of the state from society. The fact that Marx saw the state in general as class-based did not mean that he ignored the importance of distinguishing one bourgeois state from another. The state, in his view, expresses a relation between classes and is not just an instrument of the ruling class. The ruling class does not live in a vacuum. He fought for the democratization of the state, and in so doing applied himself both to the relation between the different elements of the state itself, law, parliament, and the executive or bureaucracy, and to the relation between the state and society. He was in favor of maximum possible power for the representative element and minimum possible for the bureaucratic, the independence of the judiciary from the executive, but not from parliament. He did not conceive of socialist democracy in a worker state as a different breed of animal from bourgeois democracy, but rather as the extension of democratic and liberal ideas beyond the point where bourgeois society stopped. He did not see the, quote, rule of law, end quote, as a mere hangover, but as a crucial inhibition on bureaucracy and as a crucial guarantor of individual liberty. This followed from his conception of socialist rule, not as the subordination of the individual to the collective, but as a genuine synthesis of individual freedom and the collective will. Marx's doctrine of the withering away of the state should be seen not merely as a, quote, anti-state, end quote, but rather as the extension of the principles of universal will and individual liberty embodied in the liberal idea of the state to the point of the state's own dissolution. The problems that were to confront 20th century Marxism of the growth of the state executive with that of the problems that were to confront 20th century Marxism of the growth of the state executive with that of social democracy, the conflict between the democratic form of the socialist state and its class content as a weapon of labor against capital, appeared only at the edges of Marx's writing. However, the progressive and distinctive character of Marx's critique of liberalism, as opposed to other critiques of liberalism, come out sharply in his political writings and forms the topic of the fifth section. There are limits to what can be called from Marx's own comments on jurisprudence. He examined the changing content of equal right, showing that while legal equality always entails substantive inequality, The degree and nature of that inequality will differ depending on the relations of production that underlie exchange. Thus, the inequalities present in, quote, equal exchange, end quote, between independent petty commodity producers are quite different from those present in the exchange between labor and capital, which are quite different again from those between laborers and a socialist commune. Marx did not, however, examine theoretically the development of juridic forms, from private property to law, from law to the state, and from the state and law in general to different forms of state and law. In the sixth section, I make an exploratory attempt to trace the formal connections between the juridic forms of private property, law, and the state on the basis of a close parallel with the economic forms of value, money, and capital. My aim is to follow through Marx's critique of the contradictory character of economic relations into a critique of juridic relations, and to show, on the one hand, the essential connections which link together private property, law, and state against those who dissociate them in one way or another, and on the other, the distinctions made between these legal forms against those who reduce them to one and the same legal relation. The bridges linking private property and value, law and money, state and capital are the ones which inform this part of my study. Finally, in the seventh section, I turn to those 20th century attempts to recapture, develop, and in one case refute Marx's critique of jurisprudence. The first of these is the attempt by the Russian legal theorist Evgeny Pashukanis, writing in the 1920s and 1930s, to develop Marxist theory of law and the state. His great strength lay in his attempt to derive a Marxist theory of law and the state from the method Marx used in his critique of political economy. But I criticize Pashukanis' inability to understand why law and state should be derived from relations of production, not exchange, why, quote, private property, end quote, and not, quote, the legal subject, end quote, is the elementary category in jurisprudence, and why the notion of, quote, the legal form, end quote, as a single entity obscures the distinctions between private property, law, and the state. Following from these theoretical weaknesses, I criticize Pashukanis' political failure to understand the democratic character of Marx's critique of bourgeois legality. Pashukanis' ultra-critical view of law was associated with an uncritical view of bureaucracy, quote, technical control, end quote. It was this combination that made him temporarily useful for the development of Stalinism and exemplifies the dangers besetting, quote, left, end quote, Marxism. My second case study is that of the contemporary English Marxist historian and activist Edward Thompson. His great strength has been to revive the liberal conception of the, quote, rule of law, end quote, as a weapon against the growth of state authoritarianism. He successfully demolished the right-wing view that the, quote, rule of law, end quote, means unconditional obedience to the state, irrespective of the form and content of the state's commands. The rule of law in the classical sense, which Thompson inherits, represents an inhibition on state power. Thompson also successfully attacked a, quote, cynical, end quote, tendency on the left to dismiss civil liberties as a sham and saw as merely a class instrument. Thompson also successfully attacked a, quote, cynical tendency on the left to dismiss civil liberties as a sham and law as merely a class instrument, a tendency which passes itself off as Marxism, but which in reality has little in common with Marx and the liberal tradition out of which he emerged. However, Thompson's subsuming of Marxism to a liberal commitment to the rule of law as a, quote, unqualified human good, end quote, is the target of my critique. Just as Pashukanis' variety of Marxism neglected the democratic element in liberal institutions, Thompson's, quote, right, end quote, Marxism neglected the democratic limits of liberalism. My final study is that of the French philosopher and historian Michel Foucault, who presents himself as a, quote, post-Marxist, end quote, transcending distinctions between left and right, materialism and idealism, capitalism and socialism. Foucault's theory of, quote, disciplinary power, end quote, underwrote stimulating historical critiques of asylums, prisons, hospitals, and the family, and has been widely influential even among some Marxists. His work reveals, however, a rejection of liberalism rooted in Nietzsche and based on entirely different premises from that of Marxism. Foucault's rejection of the juridic categories of private property, law, and state in favor of, quote, power, end quote, and his association of despotism with collectivity led him down a dangerous road, which I argue is not only superior which is not only not superior to Marxism, but also represents in crucial respects a regression from liberalism. Such is the outline of my book, which I hope will provide a clearer understanding both of liberal and Marxist views of jurisprudence, of the relation between them, and of the real phenomenon of private property law in the state. My own views have not remained static in the writing of it, and I hope I shall at least stimulate debate. In writing this book, the force of both liberal and Marxist ideas has been vividly impressed upon me. I am aware that both are sometimes turned into lifeless dogmas, and the conflict between them into one between two preferred faiths. At the end of this study, I came out more convinced than ever of the relevance of Marxism for contemporary theory and politics, but also of the work which we contemporary Marxists have before us.